but which I hope to submit later this year on comparative phylogeography and speciation of Phrynosomatid lizards in Baja, California, Mexico. So the goal of comparative phylogeography is to understand the historical processes that underlie the geographic distribution of genetic variation within and among species and species complexes. And a key question of the field is, are ecological communities structured by shared biogeographic history or by idiosyncratic species-specific events? And two key alternative hypotheses that are frequently tested in this field are vicariance and dispersal, which can be tested using a combination of accurate molecular clocks and geological data for calibrations. Although next-generation sequencing approaches are still rare in this field, and to the best of my knowledge, there are no published studies that use RAD-seq in a comparative phylogeographic context, although if you are aware of any, I'd love to hear about it later. The Baja California Peninsula is a rugged, isolated, and sparsely populated, and very complex landscape matrix in terms of topography, climate, and ecology. And over the past 6 million years, it rifted apart from mainland Mexico along the San Andreas Fault System, traveling about 300 miles to the northwest, which makes it an ideal natural laboratory to study hypotheses regarding speciation and phylogeography. So before plate tectonics was discovered, all the hypotheses about the biogeography of the peninsula were revolved around dispersal. So Savage in 1960 hypothesized that during the Pliocene and early Pliocene, you had north to south dispersal from the continent of North America into the peninsula, whereas in the late Pleistocene and in the Holocene, you have some northern range expansions related to glacial cycles. So these hypotheses can be tested. So a couple of previous studies using cacti along Baja looked for latitudinal gradients and heterozygosity. In this case, declining heterozygosity going south to north. And they could also look for serially nested patterns in the phylogeny so that more ancestral populations or descendant populations are more deeply nested within the phylogeny. An alternative hypothesis after plate tectonics was discovered was the Peninsular Archipelago hypothesis. This is basically, this hypothesis implies that higher sea levels during the Miocene and Pliocene flooded the peninsula into an archipelago of islands. This hypothesis is based largely on the observation of spatially concordant phylogeographic breaks among multiple species in the same areas again and again, although there's really no direct supporting geological evidence that the peninsula is completely fragmented into an archipelago by the sea wave itself. In its simplest form, at least, this hypothesis predicts that simultaneous divergence times for the multiple co-distributed taxa that all would have diverged as the sea levels rose together. Although the only study that has really explicitly tested this has found that at least 2 waves of diversification were required to explain that mid-peninsula break for rodents and squamate reptiles. Here I'll be using a slightly different approach to test this. Following Smith et al., who used ultra-conserved elements for phylogeography, I'll be comparing 95% confidence intervals or highest posterior density intervals for divergence times. And if any overlap between these intervals, I cannot reject simultaneous divergence during those intervals. But if the intervals don't overlap at all, then I can reject simultaneous divergence. So the first group of lizards I'll be looking at are the zebra-tailed lizards, Halosaurus. These lizards tend to occupy open terrain and sandy habitats and washes, beaches, and gravelly substrates. There's 6 described taxa, all of which are currently considered to be subspecies or pattern classes within one polymorphic species. The banded rock lizards, Petrosaurus, they occupy vertical surfaces, canyons, lava outcrops, and whatnot, boulders. There's 4 species described from Baja and its adjacent islands. The Urosaurus are the brush lizards. These are small lizards that are best known for occupying shrubs and brush, but they also occur in rocky areas as well. There's 3 species. And the spiny lizard, Sceloporus, there's actually 2 species complexes that are co-distributed. The Orcuti complex are more tend to be found more in rocky areas, whereas the Magister Zosteronis complex tends to be found more in open areas. This brings me to the questions I'll be addressing today. First, did the various lineages of lizards included in this study simultaneously diverge across the same areas at the same time? Or alternatively, were there multiple episodes of divergence? Secondly, I wanted to know, is heterozygosity reduced in northern populations, perhaps dispersal from the south, or the other way around? So for this study, I sampled 228 lizards throughout the Baja, California, and 8 islands in the Gulf of California and Pacific Ocean. We extracted genetic DNA from liver and muscle tissue, and we used the double digest restriction-associated DNA sequencing method of Peterson et al. To construct our genomic libraries, which were then sequenced on Illumina HiSeq 2500 at UC Riverside. For bioinformatics, I used the PIRAD pipeline, which is optimized for phylogenetics. To sort of detect the phylogeographic breaks themselves, I did a concatenated Raxamel analysis for each genus separately, an admixture analysis, which is basically the same model as structure, but is faster to run for large data sets. And I did a principal components analysis as well. To do the divergence dating, I took a concatenated approach in bees with the concatenated supermatrix. In the absence of any sort of fossil calibrations, I used a mammalian substitution rate and a relaxed log normal clock, which isn't exactly ideal, but sort of the best I can do for the time being. And then to look at heterozygosity and latitude, I did a standard linear regression, but because that doesn't account for phylogeny, I also did a phylogenetic generalized least squares, and I looked for concordance among those results. So for Calosaurus, I'm going to show you all the results, and then I'll show you just partial results for the other groups. So Calosaurus, here's a concatenated Raxamel tree of over 1,000 loci, and basically found 7 well-supported clades. First is Rhodostictus in the north, which is sister to Splendidus on Isla Angel de la Guarda. An unnamed central population here, Carmenensis from northern Baja Sur. Calosaurus crinitus, which is a sand-dwelling ecomorph restricted to the sand dunes of the Vizcaino Desert. Plasticus, which is a subspecies that was sunk a long time ago but seems to closely match my data. And finally, the type Dracanoides endemic to the Cape region. Again, here's that same data set in beast. So I have a time-calibrated tree millions of years ago. This is the admixture analysis, which is more or less the same as structure. And here I have principal components 1, 2, 3, and 4. And again, just going through this really quickly, you can see that all 7 of these clades were supported in all 3 of these analyses. So for Petrosaurus, I found a northern clade of Petrosaurus mirenzi from northern Baja. In southern Baja, I found that Slavini from the island was actually belonging to a clade that consisted of southern mirenzi. Within Repens, I discovered a northern, a central, and a southern clade with high support. And again, similar to Calosaurus, we have an endemic Cape species. For Urosaurus, I found that Urosaurus latelli, which is only found here in the Catavina region, in a small boulder field, was sister to the remaining Urosaurus from all the peninsula. I found this northern population of Urosaurus, which was deeply nested within, Microscutatus, which is deeply nested within the southern Microscutatus. And again, we kind of see this serially nested pattern going south to north, indicating a northern range extension. And then within Nigroquatus in the south, we have a northern clade from the Magdalena region, and then a Cape clade here. For Orcudi, we have a northern and a southern clade with a large sampling gap here. And then in the Cape region, we actually have 2 endemics, Hunsakerai and Likai, which are recovered as monophyletic. In this tree, they come out as sister, but with a poor support. In the east tree, that relationship was not supported. Finally, the Magister complex, we have Magister in the Colorado Desert in Southern California. And then within Zosteronis, we have a northern and a southern clade, which meet right around Laguna San Ignacio. All right, now looking at latitude and heterozygosity. There's a lot going on in the slide, but basically On the left is Callosaurus, on the right is Scoloporus. On the top is all samples, and the bottom I excluded the island samples. So here you can see island samples removed. We get a better fit here. So Callosaurus actually showed a positive relationship with heterozygosity and latitude, so heterozygosity increases as you go north. However, in the PGLS, this was not significant. Scoloporus did not show a pattern either way. This didn't matter if I excluded islands or not, or if I analyzed the Magister or Cut-eye groups separately. By contrast, for Petrosaurus and Urosaurus, both of these groups did show inverse correlations between latitude and heterozygosity. So heterozygosity was decreasing going north, as would be predicted under northern range expansion. In both cases, this is significant using PGLS as well. In both cases, the fit of the data improved when islands were excluded. So, just to summarize, I found 5 areas along the peninsula and islands where at least 2 taxa showed breaks in the same areas. The first is the Vizcaíno Desert. The second is the Loreto region. 5 minutes, thank you. The third is Isthmus of La Paz. The fourth is Isla Anglo de la Guarda. And finally, Isla Espiritu Santo. So I'll go through each of these separately. First, in the Vizcaíno Desert, I have, here's the different groups. These are the mean estimates and the 95% highest posterior densities. Looking at the overlaps here, that we can see that at least 3 waves of divergence are required, and we can reject the simultaneous divergence hypothesis. For the Loreto region, again, 3 out of the 5 groups showed a break there, but again, none of these intervals overlapped at all. So at least 3 waves of divergence were required, and again, we can reject simultaneous divergence. For the Isthmus of La Paz, here, which separates this subtropical, tropical Cape region from the more arid peninsula to the northwest, we see all the groups showed a break there, but again, at least 2 waves of divergence are required in this case, and we can reject simultaneous divergence. For Isla Anglo de la Guarda, this is an especially interesting one. Although there's only 2 taxa out of the 5 present on this island for comparison, they don't overlap in their divergence dates, but we do have an estimate of the age of the island of 2 to 3 million years ago. This is actually the sort of the San Andreas fault system here. The island broke off from the peninsula much in the same way that the peninsula broke off from mainland Mexico. And using that as a calibration, we can infer that Callosaurus likely may have originated by vicariance, whereas Petrosaurus must have dispersed over water. Finally, for Isla Espiritu Santo, we have 3 taxa present, but at least 2 waves of divergence are required. We know this is a land bridge island from the Pleistocene, and the Pleistocene divergence states are consistent with this. So this brings me to my conclusions. So first, we found south to north dispersal supported in Urosaurus and Petrosaurus with the latitudinal gradients and heterozygosity, and this is also supported by the Pleistocene timing of divergence. We did see the nested phylogeographic pattern going south to north in Urosaurus, but however, this pattern was not seen in Callosaurus or Scoloporus. Callosaurus showed the opposite pattern, but was not significant PGLS. Scoloporus showed no relationship at all. In all 5 cases where we compared over breaks, we reject simultaneous divergence, and taking these results together, we see these idiosyncratic phylogeographic patterns, we see multiple waves of divergence, and this seems to me to be most consistent with a model of dispersal across a landscape matrix as previously shaped by tectonic events rather than the tectonic events themselves causing divergence through simultaneous vicariance. Thus, we found little to no support for the peninsular archipelago hypothesis, and I question really what role vicariance plays in the biogeography here, except possibly in the case of Anglo de la Guarda for Callosaurus. With that, I'd like to acknowledge all those funding sources and permits, advisors, committee, and all the students and people who have helped me out. And if I have any time, I'll take questions over Gottscho.